Hey mom, finally I'm getting to chapter 5 for you now. I didn't realize you were all caught up. So, I'm going to start reading chapter 5 of Michelle Obama's Becoming. I sat her back here on the mantle so you could see her and remember as we're reading who I'm reading. So, here's her book. Um, so now I'm all ready. We had class today, so we're studying First John, and we're in chapter 3 now. And so we finished with all that, and we came home, and I got to eat something, and now I'm ready to read. So hope you like it. Let's see where we left off. Chapter 5. My mother ultimately did go back to work right about the time I began high school, catapulting herself out of the house and the neighborhood and into the dense, skyscrapered heart of Chicago, where she found a job as an executive assistant at a bank. She bought a work wardrobe and began commuting each morning, catching the bus north on Jeffrey Boulevard or riding along with my dad in the Buick if their start times happened to line up. The job for her was a welcome shift in routine, and for our family it was also more or less a financial necessity. My parents had been paying tuition for Craig to go to Catholic school. He was starting to think about college, with me coming up right behind him. My brother was now full grown, a graceful giant with uncanny spring in his legs, and considered one of the best basketball players in the city. At home, he ate a lot. He drained gallons of milk, devoured entire large pizzas in one sitting. I just did that. And often snacked from dinner to bedtime. He managed, as he'd always done, to both be easygoing and deeply focused, maintaining scads of friends and good grades while also turning heads as an athlete. He traveled around the Midwest on a summer rec league team that featured an incubating superstar named Isaiah Thomas. I don't know from sports, but I recognize that name. And would later go on to a Hall of Fame career in the NBA. As he approached high school, Craig had been sought after by some of Chicago's top public school coaches looking to fill gaps in their rosters. These teams pulled in big rowdy crowds as well as college scouts, but my parents were adamant that Craig not sacrifice his intellectual development for the short-lived glory of being a high school phenom. Mount Carmel, with its strong Catholic League basketball team and rigorous curriculum, had seemed the best solution, worth the thousands of dollars it was costing my parents. Craig's teachers were brown-robed priests who went by Father. About 80% of his classmates were white, many of them Irish Catholic kids who came from outlying working-class white neighborhoods. By the end of his junior year, he was already being courted by Division I college teams, a couple of which would probably offer him a free ride. Still, my parents held fast to the idea that he should keep all options open, aiming to get himself into the best college possible. They alone would worry about the cost. There we go. My high school experience blessedly cost us nothing except for bus fare. I was lucky enough to test into Chicago's first magnet high school, Whitney M. Young High School, which sat in what was then a run-down area just west of the Loop and was, after a few short years in existence, on its way to becoming a top public school in the city. Whitney Young was named for a civil rights activist and had been opened in 1975 as a positive-minded alternative to busing. Shouldn't that be to us? No, I'm editing as I'm reading. Located squarely on the dividing line between the north and the south sides of the city and featuring forward-thinking teachers and brand new facilities, the school was designed as a kind of equal opportunity nirvana meant to draw high-performing students of all colors. Admissions quotas set by the Chicago School Board called for a student body that would be 40% black, 40% white, 20% Hispanic or other. But the reality of who enrolled looked slightly different. When I attended, about 80% of the students were non-white. Just getting to Just getting to school for my first day of ninth grade was a whole new odyssey, involving 90 minutes of nerve-pummeling travel on two different city bus routes, as well as a transfer downtown. Hauling myself out of bed at 5 o'clock that morning, I'd put on all new clothes and a pair of nice earrings, unsure of how any of it would be received on the other end of my bus trek. I'd eaten breakfast, having no idea where lunch would be. I said goodbye to my parents, unclear on whether I'd even still be myself at the end of the day. High school was meant to be transformative, and Whitney Young, for me, was pure frontier. The school itself was striking and modern, like no school I'd ever seen, made up of three large cube-shaped buildings, two of them connected by a fancy-looking glass skyway that crossed over the Jackson Boulevard thoroughfare. The classrooms were open concept and thoughtfully designed. There was a whole building dedicated to the arts, with special rooms for the choir to sing and bands to play, and other rooms that had been outfitted for photography and pottery. The whole place was built like a temple for learning. Students streamed through the main entryway, purposeful already on day one. There were about 1,900 kids at Whitney Young, and from my point of view, they appeared universally older and more confident than I'd ever be, in full command of every brain cell, powered by every multiple choice question they'd nailed on the citywide standardized test. Looking around, I felt small. I'd been one of the older kids at Bryn Mawr and was now among the youngest of the high schoolers. Getting off the bus, I'd noticed that along with their book bags, a lot of girls carried actual purses. My worries about high school, if they were to be cataloged, could mostly be filed under one general heading: Am I good enough? It was a question that dogged me throughout my first month, even as I began to settle in, even as I got used to the pre-dawn wake-ups and navigating between buildings for class. Whitney Young was subdivided into 5 houses, each one serving as a home base for its members and meant to add intimacy to the big school experience. I was in the Gold House, led by an assistant principal named Mr. Smith, who happened to live a few doors down from my family on Euclid Avenue. I'd been doing odd jobs for Mr. Smith and his family for years, having been hired to do everything from babysitting his kids and giving them piano lessons to attempting to train their untrainable puppy. Seeing Mr. Smith at school was a mild comfort, a bridge between Whitney Young and my neighborhood, but it did little to offset my anxiety. Just a few kids from my neighborhood had come to Whitney Young. My neighbor and friend Terry Johnson had gotten in, and so had my classmate Chiaka, whom I'd known and been in friendly competition with since kindergarten, as well as one or two boys. Some of us rode the bus together in the mornings and back home at the end of the day, but at school we were scattered between houses, mostly on our own. I was also operating for the first time ever without the tacit protection of my older brother Craig. Craig, in his ambling and smiley way, had conveniently broken every trail for me. At Bryn Mawr, he'd softened up the teachers with his sweetness and earned a certain cool kid respect on the playground. He'd created sunshine that I could just step into. I had always, pretty much everywhere I'd gone, been known as Craig Robinson's little sister. Now, though, I was just Michelle Robinson, with no Craig attached. At Whitney Young, I had to work to ground myself. My initial strategy involved keeping quiet and trying to observe my new classmates. Who were these kids anyway? All I knew was that they were smart, demonstrably smart, selectively smart, the smartest kids in the city, apparently. But wasn't I as well? Hadn't all of us, me and Terry and Chiaka, landed here because we were smart like them? Truth is, I didn't know. I had no idea whether we were smart like them. I knew only that we were the best students coming out of what was thought to be a middling, mostly black school in a middling, mostly black neighborhood. But what if that wasn't enough? What if, after all this fuss, we were just the best of the worst? This was the doubt that sat in my mind through student orientation, through my first sessions of high school biology and English, through my somewhat fumbling get-to-know-you conversations in the cafeteria with new friends. Not enough, not enough. It was doubt about where I came from and what I believed about myself until now. It was like a malignant cell that threatened to divide and divide again unless I could find some way to stop it. Chicago, I was learning, was a much bigger city than I'd ever imagined it to be. This is where a lot of Dad's family are from. They're in Chicago, outside of Mounds, Illinois. So now everybody lives in Chicago, apparently. So this is funny. Wouldn't that be funny if we were related to Michelle Obama or Barack? Okay, anyway, this was a revelation formed in part over the 3 hours I now logged daily on the bus, boarding a set at 75th Street and chuffing through a maze of local stops, often forced to stand because it was too crowded to find a seat. I remember those days. Through the window, I got a long, slow view of the South Side in what felt like its entirety, its corner stores and barbecue joints still shuttered in the gray light of early morning, its basketball courts and paved playgrounds lying empty. We'd go north on Jeffrey and then west on 67th Street, then north again, zagging and stopping every 2 blocks to collect more people. We crossed Jackson Park Highlands and Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago campus sat hidden behind a massive wrought iron gate. After what felt like an eternity, we'd finally accelerate onto Lakeshore Drive, following the curve of Lake Michigan north toward downtown. There's no hurrying a bus ride, I can tell you. You get on and you endure. That's the best way to put it. Like, yeah, I remember you just endure. Every morning I'd switch buses downtown at Michigan Avenue at the height of rush hour, catching a westbound ride along Van Buren Street, where the view of it at least where the view at least got more interesting as we passed bank buildings with big gold doors and bellhops standing outside the fancy hotels. Through the window I watched men and women in smart outfits, in suits and skirts and clicking heels, carrying their coffee to work with a bustle of self-importance. I didn't yet know that people like this were called professionals. I hadn't yet tracked the degrees they must have had to earn to gain access to the tall corporate castles lining Van Buren. But I did like how determined they looked. Sorry, itch. Meanwhile, at school I was quietly collecting bits of data, trying to sort out my place inside the teenage intelligentsia. Until now, my experiences with kids from other neighborhoods had been limited to visits with various cousins and a few summers of city-run day camp at Rainbow Beach, where every camper still came from some part of the South Side and nobody was well off. At Whitney Young, I met white kids who lived on the North Side, a part of Chicago that felt like the dark side of the moon, a place I'd never thought about nor had reason to go. More intriguing was my early discovery that there was such a thing as an African American elite. Most of my new high school friends were black, but that didn't necessarily translate, it turned out, to any sort of uniformity in our experience. A number of them had parents who were lawyers or doctors and seemed to know one another through an African American social club called Jack and Jill. They'd been on ski vacations and trips that required passports. They talked about things that were foreign to me, like summer internships and historically black colleges. One of my black classmates, a nerdy boy who was always kind to everyone, had parents who'd founded a big beauty supply company and lived in one of the ritziest high rises downtown. This was my new world. It's not to say that everyone at the school was rich or overly sophisticated, because that wasn't the case. There were plenty of kids who came from neighborhoods just like mine, who struggled with far more than I ever would. But my first months at Whitney Young gave me a glimpse of something that had previously been invisible: the apparatus of privilege and connection, what seemed like a network of half-hidden ladders and guide ropes that lay suspended overhead, ready to connect some but not all of us to the sky. My first round of grades at school turned out to be pretty good, and so did my second. Over the course of my freshman and sophomore years, I began to build the same kind of confidence I had at Bryn Mawr. With each little accomplishment, with every high school screw-up I managed to avoid, my doubts slowly took leave. I liked most of my teachers. I wasn't afraid to raise my hand in class. At Whitney Young, it was safe to be smart. The assumption was that everyone was working toward college, which meant that you never hid your intelligence for fear of someone saying you talked like a white girl. I loved any subject that involved writing and labored through pre-calculus. I can't even. I couldn't even make it through algebra. It's like business math. Okay, I'm done. That's all I need. Give me my degree. I was a half-decent French student. I had peers who were always a step or two ahead of me, whose achievements seemed effortless, but I tried not to let that get to me. I was beginning to understand that if I put in extra hours of studying, I could often close the gap. I wasn't a straight A student, but I was always trying, and there were semesters when I got close. Craig, her brother, meanwhile had enrolled at Princeton University, vacating his back porch room on Euclid Avenue, leaving a 6'6", 200-pound gap in our daily lives. Our fridge was considerably less loaded with meat and milk, the phone line no longer tied up by girls calling to chat him up. He'd been recruited by big universities offering scholarships and what amounted to a celebrity existence playing basketball, but with my parents' encouragement, he'd chosen Princeton, which cost more, but as they saw it, promised more as well. My father burst with pride when Craig became a starter as a sophomore on Princeton's basketball team. Wobbly on his feet and using two canes to walk, he still relished a long drive. He traded in his old Buick for a new Buick, another 225. This one was a shimmering deep maroon. When, remember the Delta 88 that Dad had back in Kansas? That was the maroon colored car too. I remember when he bought it and we were looking at the Delta 98, but I guess he went with the 88 because that was probably more affordable. But I don't know why I remember that. But it was maroon. And Nicole, show Mom pictures of the driveway and the neighborhood in Kansas, and you can see us in our Easter outfits, actually, with our dog Mitzi in front, standing at the back of the car, so you can see it. I don't know why I remember Delta 98, 88, 88. Find the pictures. Where the heck am I? There we go. He traded in his old Buick for a new Buick, another 225, this one a shimmering deep maroon. When he could get the time off from his job at the filtration plant, he'd drive 12 hours across Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey to catch one of Craig's games. Remember, we used to drive from Kansas all the way into Indiana and into Ohio to visit Medea for Christmas and sometimes Easter. So they kind of rode the same road, that took the same way that we did. How funny. By nature of my long commute to Whitney Young, I saw less of my parents, and looking back at it, I'd guess that it was a lonely time for them, or at least required some adjustment. I was now gone more than I was at home. Tired of standing through the 90-minute bus ride to school, Terry Johnson and I figured out a kind of trick which involved leaving our houses 15 minutes earlier in the morning and catching a bus that was headed in the opposite direction from school. We rode a few stops south to a less busy neighborhood, then jumped out, crossed the street, and hailed our regular northbound bus, which was reliably emptier than it would be at 75th, where we normally boarded. Pleased by our own cleverness, we'd smugly claim a seat and then talk or study the whole way to school. Wow, the things you have to figure out on the bus. The bus. Oh. In the evenings, I dragged myself back through the door around 6 or 7 o'clock in time for a quick dinner and a chance to talk to my parents about whatever had gone on that day. But once the dishes had been washed, I disappeared into homework, often taking my books downstairs to the encyclopedia nook off the stairwell next to Robbie and Terry's apartment for privacy and quiet. My parents never once spoke of the stress of having to pay for college, but I knew enough to appreciate that it was there. When my French teacher announced that she'd be leading an optional class trip to Paris over one of our breaks for those who could come up with the money to do it, I didn't even bother to raise the issue at home. This was the difference between me and the Jack and Jill kids, many of whom were now my close friends. I had a loving and orderly home, bus fare to get me across town to school, and a hot meal to come home to at night. Beyond that, I wasn't going to ask my parents for a thing. Yet one evening my parents set me down looking puzzled. My mom had learned about the France trip through Terry Johnson's mom. "Why didn't you tell us?" she said. "Because it's too much money. That's actually not for you to decide, Mish," my dad said gently, almost offended. "And how are we supposed to decide if we don't even know about it?" I looked at them both, unsure of what to say. My mother glanced at me, her eyes soft. My father had changed out of his work uniform and into a clean white shirt. They were in their early 40s then, married nearly 20 years. Neither one of them had ever vacationed in Europe. They never took beach trips or went out to dinner. They didn't own a house. We were their investment, me and Craig. Everything went into us. A few months later, I boarded a flight to Paris with my teacher and a dozen or so of my classmates from Whitney Young. We would stay in a hostel rather, tour the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower. We'd buy crêpes au fromage, cheese crepes, from stands on the street and walk along the banks of the Seine. That's a river that goes through France. We'd speak French like a bunch of high school kids from Chicago, but we'd at least speak French. As the plane pulled away from its gate that day, I looked out my window and back at the airport, knowing that my mother stood somewhere behind its black glass windows, dressed in her winter coat and waving me on. I remember the jet engines firing, shockingly loud. And then we were rattling down the runway and beginning to tilt upward as the acceleration seized my chest and pressed me backward into my seat for that strange in-between half moment that comes before finally you feel lifted. And Mom, I remember there's a picture of some outdoor cafe in Paris that your dad probably sent when he was stationed in Paris. But I think you guys got to go, you and Tony and Harlan got to go to Paris. I think you lived there for maybe a year or two because he was stationed there. And I didn't find that out until you came to visit with Medea one time when you were visiting Tony when he got sick. But then I found out that you guys had lived in Paris before. And so I was happy to find that out because Walter and I got to visit Paris when we were in England doing the Robotica show. So we took a day trip over to Paris. So I got to be in the same place where you were. So we saw outdoor cafes, just like the picture. So thought that was cool. So, Nicole, if you can find a picture, a black and white picture from the mid 40s that looks like just an outdoor cafe, that's the picture I'm talking about. So, see if you see that and remember that. So, and I remember you also telling me how your dad, our grandfather, would send you dolls from different countries over in Europe, and Tony would tie them all up together, tie their hair together, and mess them up and swing them around and stuff. Typical boy. But I remember you telling me that. So he sent you things from Europe. And also, remember you have that book, Little Pictures of Japan, that he sent you when he was probably in Okinawa or somewhere in Japan. So you have that book still. So I remember that. It's got a blue cover and a picture of a lady in a kimono and maybe a tree on it, if I remember that. So I remember those are some of the things that your dad would send from when he was overseas. So okay, meanwhile, let's get back to this. In the manner of all high schoolers everywhere, my friends and I liked to loiter. We loitered boisterously, we loitered in public. On days when school got out early or when homework was light, we flocked from Whitney Young to downtown Chicago, landing in the 8-story mall, wow, at Water Tower Place. Once there, we rode the escalators up and down, spent our money on gourmet popcorn from Garrett's, and commandeered tables at McDonald's for more hours than was reasonable, given how little food we ordered. We browsed the designer jeans and the purses at Marshall Field's, often surreptitiously tailed by security guards who didn't like the look of us. Sometimes we went to a movie. We were happy, happy with our freedom, happy with one another, happy with the way the city seemed to glitter more on days when we weren't thinking about school. We were city kids learning how to range. I spent a lot of my time with a classmate named Santita Jackson, who in the mornings boarded the Jeffrey bus a few stops after I did, and who became one of my best friends in high school. Santita had beautiful dark eyes, full cheeks, and the bearing of a wise woman, even at 16. At school, she was one of those kids who signed up for every AP class available and seemed to ace them all. She wore skirts when everyone else wore jeans and had a singing voice so clear and powerful that she'd end up touring years later as a backup singer for Roberta Flack. She was also deep. It's what I loved most about Santita. Like me, she could be frivolous and goofy when we were with the larger group, but on our own, we got ponderous and intense. Two girl philosophers trying to sort out life's issues, big and small. We passed hours sprawling on the floor of Santita's room on the second floor of her family's white Tudor house in Jackson Park Highlands, a more affluent section of South Shore, talking about things that irked us and where our lives were headed and what we did and didn't understand about the world. As a friend, she was a good listener and insightful, and I tried to be the same. Santita's father was famous. This was the primary impossible to get around fact of her life. She was the eldest child of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the firebrand Baptist preacher and increasingly powerful political leader. Remember, he's who passed away just recently. I think he was 86. So this is the guy she grew up with, went to high school with his daughter. Wow. Nicole, show mom a picture, a video or something. Jackson had worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. and had risen to national prominence himself in the early 1970s as the founder of a political organization called Operation Push, which advocated for the rights of underserved African Americans. By the time we were in high school, he'd become an outright celebrity, charismatic, well-connected, and constantly on the move. He toured the country, mesmerizing crowds with thundering calls for Black people to shake off the undermining ghetto stereotypes and claim their long-denied political power. He preached a message of relentless, let's do this self-empowerment. Down with dope, up with hope, he'd call to his audiences. He had school kids sign pledges to turn off the TV and devote 2 hours to their homework each night. He made parents promise to stay involved. He pushed back against the feelings of failure that permeated so many African American communities, urging people to quit with the self-pity and take charge of their own destiny. Nobody, but nobody, he'd yell, is too poor to turn off the TV 2 hours a night. Let me check and see if you can hear me. Hold that thought.